interesting book by Richard Powers called Generosity, about a woman at a university who is a refugee from a very difficult situation in Southeast Asia camp, and that she was in as a child, I believe, in Cambodia. And she is an incredibly happy person. The university decides to study her because, you know, there's a lot of talk in research in neuroscience circles about whether some people have the happiness gene, and that's what it's based on. The name of the book is Generosity, so it's a book about whether happiness is an innate quality. Right. It's really interesting. But you were going to ask a question.
Yes, do either of you use short stories?
Yes. Alice Munro is on my list a lot. I think she's a cure for everything. She's a cure for everything for me. So,
the reason I ask is Robert Coles uses a reading list for his students that are pre-med at Harvard. And I've used a lot of those. It turns out they all cover the area, cover everything that could be seen clinically.
Yeah, there's
all short stories.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful.
I'd love to see that list.
You just Google Robert Coles.
Okay.
There's a beautiful story by Richard Ford called Sweethearts, about change and loss and what it means to love someone despite their failings. And which I find is quite beautiful. The woman has this with the new man in her life, but she has to drive her ex-husband to prison. He has to go to prison, and she has to drive him there. You know, he's given himself up, and he has to report to the imprisonment. It's quite a beautiful story about what it means to understand what love can be like in circumstances that are so difficult. So I do use that story. In general, though, I use novels.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting question, because sometimes short story can pack a punch in a way that is quite specific. I mean, a novel will be working on many different levels and with lots of different messages going on, and well, not message in that the writer wanted to give a message, but just, you know, that one picks up many different messages. Whereas a story, in a way, is quite often just about one thing, really. Yeah. So I think they can be brilliant, and I'm not as I don't read short stories as much as I read novels personally, so I'm not as expert at prescribing them as I wish I was. But I think they are great for it.
You prescribe, for like a parent that's having difficulty with the child, you prescribe a shared book that they can read together.
Yeah, that is really powerful, and actually we do a lot of reading aloud between couples in relationship, and between we quite often do get a mother and a daughter, or you know, coming together, and that's really wonderful because you can give them the same book, tell them to either read aloud to each other or to just read it at the same time and then talk about it afterwards, and that can be fantastic, and a lovely bridge between people who have kind of lost a bond in some way. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
Why do you think bibliotherapy works?
Why do I think it works?
Yeah.
I think something happens within the pages of a novel which doesn't happen often in real life, in day-to-day life, which is that we get to, in a really magical way, because it can happen with somebody who's dead in another era or in another country, to hang out with their thoughts, or their dramatized thoughts, I should say, really, that touch upon those sort of experiences that we don't talk about very much, and kind of what goes on inside our heads and what comes out of our mouths are often quite different things. And through novels we get to see and know about what goes on inside heads. And in really good, in novels written by really skillful authors, we get to know what's going on in somebody's head without it being spelled out, but just by what they're doing. And those are the novels I like best. And that's a kind of communion across the ages and across cultures that is a way of understanding and sharing and exploring the human condition in a way that very little else does for me. I mean, I know some people have this with art, and some people have it through film, can be amazingly powerful, but I think books just do it at a whole other level for me, because it's an intense solitary communion with that other intellect.
And a sustained, as you were saying, a sustained encounter with that other intellect. I mean, I think if you were to do a comparison, you would say that poetry would be the electric shock of bibliotherapy, and a novel would be the talk therapy. You know, that a poem can change your life, obviously, and shock you and lead you to in other direction. But a book is that sustained encounter with another sensibility, another mind.
And even if it's not being transformative, I mean, I think it's important to remember. I still read for the story sometimes. I still read to just be transported, or just to escape, or to be diverted, or whatever, or for the sound of the words, or lots of different reasons actually. And it's not that you're always looking for some deep psychological insight. So there's lots of reasons to read, but I think there's something very meditative about being in the depths of a book and not being able to put it down and just wanting the world to go away. And actually the world has gone away because you're not sure where you're sitting anymore when you're reading, and really engrossed. And that's, I don't know if, I'm always trying to persuade my neuroscientist husband to do a study on, looking at the brain waves when somebody is deeply engrossed in a book, comparing it with somebody who's meditating, comparing it with somebody who's doing headstand and yoga. There surely is a similar thing going on there, because you're focused, you're utterly focused, you're not responding to all these other essential things going on.
Well, you had a question in the back, though.
Oh, I did. I wanted to know, when you were researching this, if you had remembered from years past books that you thought would be great cures, and then went back and revisited and thought...
I don't want to be asked this question, because yes, I do, and I feel really bad about it. Well...
That's all right, we're not going to tell
Yes,
anybody.
no, it's okay, but I feel bad because I still love this author. Okay, so there's a book called Dreams of Leaving by Ella Berthoud, which was one of the novels which got me writing. I mean, I always wanted to write, but it was just full of amazing images and really fun thing. And it's a beautiful, slightly fantastical story about a family, a couple who live in a village in England where nobody's allowed to leave. And there are these cardboard policemen on the horizon stopping you leaving. And actually there's no physical barrier to you leaving, but anybody who's ever tried to leave has gone crazy because of the kind of intimidation and So this couple have a baby, and she's very depressed, and she knows that this is no world to bring a baby into. And he's called Moses, and she makes a basket for him out of bulrushes and puts him in the river and sends him downstream. And then the next moment you wake up to him being 19-year-old hunk in London on the rave scene. It's a great transition. And it's a great, great book. But I remember it being utterly transformative as a 22, 23, 24-year-old. And now I'm 44, and I liked it, but it didn't do it for me. And it just made me aware, I don't want to put people off this author, because he's wonderful.
He's wonderful.
But it was a book of its age, and maybe of his age too, and it didn't work for me anymore.
And your age when you read it.
Yeah, and that's it. And on the other hand, I read Anna Karenina at about that age, and I thought it was a gripping story, but it didn't really have a massive impact on me. I read it again for this. It's like, oh my God, why have I been reading anything but Tolstoy? It's amazing, and so you bring your emotional maturity to something and you find much more in it.
Interesting.
Have you ever had anybody say, you've read, given them a book, they've read it, and they say, well, the movie's coming out, but I'd never go to that movie because it would spoil my relationship with the book?
I've never had anyone say that to me. I've had that feeling myself, though, that I'm reluctant to say it. I did not go to see Cloud Atlas, for example.
Right.
No.
I loved that book. I really loved that book, and I just did not want to see the movie.
Although the one movie I've not been disappointed in is The English Patient. Did you ever see the film of The English Patient?
Yes.
That was beautiful, and it did something quite different to the book in some ways, but also kind of helped me with the book, because it's a really difficult book. And it hasn't spoiled my enjoyment of the book, because I go back to that a lot, and I read it just in fragments sometimes, because he's that sort of writer, and you don't have to read it in a linear way. And that book, that film, I loved as much as the book, actually.
And The Hours by Michael Cunningham, too. I thought that movie was a good adaptation.
And the classic great movie from Great Book, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Oh yes, absolutely. Well, absolutely. They both stand up.
Yeah, they're both great. Do we have a few more questions?
Now they're making a play of it.
To Kill a Mockingbird? Make a Broadway play.
Yeah. Kind of my favourite book of all time. That.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a perfect book. So it's strange that she never wrote another book.
Yeah. But how could you follow it up, really?
I don't know. It's a good question.
I'm surprised they don't recommend that book in high school, for high school reading.
They do.
Well, they
Oh,
do.
they do?
They do.
My
Yeah.
son read it in
Yeah.
high school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's popular. Anyone else? Any other questions?
Does anybody have an ailment they want to present us with? We will have a go at prescribing for you.
Love sickness.
Sorry?
Love sickness.
Love sickness.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Give us a few. You're in love, unrequited love, or you're love that's annoying or
It's about to bloom, that sort of like trembling moment before it sort of takes off.
Oh, when you can't think about anything else and you can't eat and you feel faint. Well, I'm tempted to give you our cure for love sickness in here, which I haven't found anything better for, which is Patricia Highsmith.
Can you read us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I can do. It's let me see if it's the one that we'll read. So I could read it or I could sum it up. What do you prefer? What do you prefer, guys?
The others were. The other was so nice to read.
Okay, so it's called The Price of Salt. And it's about love sickness between two women. So it's a nice twist on it. Literary heroes and heroines have been pining away from love sickness for ages. Case in point, Palamon in Chaucer's 14th century The Knight's Tale, who, having caught sight of fair Emily through the window of the tower where he is imprisoned, nearly wastes away from the effects of seeing but not having her. It is only in our less romantic era that psychiatrists are called in and drugs prescribed. Our drug-free cure is a bracing dose of love requited. Highsmith's second novel was inspired by an incident in her own life when she was working in a department store selling children's dolls, just like Therese in The Price of Salt. She was so bowled over by a customer who seemed to give off light and made her feel that she had seen a vision that she went home and sketched out the story in 2 hours flat. The tale is one of unexpected passion between two women, Carol in her 30s with a daughter and a husband she's in the process of leaving, and Therese, 19, drifting from job to job but with a flair for set design. It is Therese, the shop girl, who initiates their affair. At first, Therese is openly besotted and Carol remains playfully aloof. Therese's boyfriend is disconcerted. She has made no attempt to hide her obsession from him. It's worse than being lovesick, he tells her, because it's so completely unreasonable, failing to believe in the possibility of same-sex love. But what is true love but the triumph of emotion over reason? When Carol and Therese take off on a road trip around the States, Carol opens up to Therese and they become fully entwined. When the two suddenly find themselves apart, they believe forever. Therese experiences extreme love sickness, total lassitude and despair. How would the world come back to life? How would the salt come back? Only Carol can save her from her love-sick state, and she does. So sometimes you need to give people the antidote. But it's nice that in there it is described and you know that it's kind of nice to have your feeling reflected back to you.
And I can give you a cautionary tale. It's a very well-known book. The Great Gatsby. It's the great tale of love sickness. And a cautionary one at that. And then, of course, there's Gary Steingart's super sad true love story, which is about love in the midst of everything that is coming at us from all directions in contemporary life, and how we manage that.
And the classic Pat of Beaufort.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes, good.
Dear.
Yes, although she's
Another
so
card
cute, isn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Over, not me.
I had a deferred condition. What would you recommend for feeling overwhelmed by choice to the point of being
To the point of being
stagnant?
stagnant, yeah. Yes, that's a very good one and a very big remedy, a big ailment of our times. I'm going to think about that for a while.
No choice.
his.
Well, there's a beautiful book that's just out by Alice McDermott called Someone, which is about the choices people make in their lives and how that affects them, and how, I guess the lesson of that, it's a young Irish-American woman living in a mostly Irish-American community in Brooklyn before the Second World War, it is, the tale is that sometimes when you think you're overwhelmed by choice, what is accidental turns out to save you. I think is the lesson that's happened. And so that's it. That's fine. Any others?
So mine is sort of situational as well rather than emotional, but what would you recommend for, say, a young woman such as yourself living in a very expensive city, dealing with a lot of debt and feeling kind of crushed by this fear of what to do about money a lot?
There's a great book by Rima Godden, who's an English novelist who's not wrote very much these days, but she's fabulous, called Kingfishers Catch Fire, and it's a great tale of how to romanticize austerity and to get yourself excited by the idea of austerity and living really simply. And it's a really gorgeous story about, well, she's actually a slightly unlikable heroine, and she totally romanticizes poverty really, but she does it really thoroughly, and she lives this, she's a single mother of 2 children, and she's living in rural Kashmir, and up in the mountains where it's really cold, and there are occasional wild animals come and sort of take the sheep from sort of just above their house, and it's actually quite a seriously scary place to live. And her children are really discontented to begin with, and then they start to kind of get into the simple way of life. And they sort of sail little walnut shell boats in the stream. They keep goats, and they kind of have a lovely simple approach to life. And she reads and rediscovers reading, which is why I love her as well. And she's a kind of difficult person. She has occasional bursts of extravagance, so she can't say no to this beautiful rug that's kind of ridiculously expensive, and so she buys it anyway, and then she has to eat nothing but chickpeas for 6 months, and the children do too. But it's a way of helping you to find a joy in a sort of monkish denial.
And incidentally, that's Demi Moore's favorite writer, and she named her daughter after her. A little bit of trivia: Bruce Willis and Demi Moore's daughter was named after that writer. I seem to be full of cautionary tales, but I don't know why. I better work on that. But House of Mirth might be instructive to a young woman dealing with debt, a direction not to go into. That could be helpful. And about the choices that you make because you fear the situation of debt, anything by Balzac, The Pergolo is a good one. There's also a non-fiction book by Margaret Atwood. I can't remember the title of it. I think it's called Debt. Is it something like that? It's called Debt, I believe, and it's about the accumulating debt in the Western world and how people can cope with that. And then this isn't a novel that I gave my son-in-law to encourage him to be more responsible with money, called Money and the Meaning of Life by Jacob Needleman.
Did it work?
No, it did not work. But maybe it will work for you. But debt, unlike happy marriages, debt is, especially 19th century novels,
Yes, it's
18th and 19th century,
Yeah.
in so many of them.
Yeah, and also going back to Richard Ford, what was the one we were talking about earlier, the Richard Ford novel?
Sports writer.
The sports writer, no, it wasn't that one, it was another one.
Layla Land.
I'll think of it in a minute.
What's the middle one? The middle frame
No, I'm not coming to it. I'm thinking about, there are lots of novels in which there are wealthy people who are just supremely unhappy, and it's quite fun to
Yeah. Any others? well, I do think that the best thing for you to do, if you don't publicly want to ask a question about anything going on in your life, would be to buy this book. Because it will be exceedingly helpful to you. And you could even more than that, you could contact Susan and schedule a session, which would be, you've had to take on another bibliotherapist or so busy. So there you go. So please buy the book. It's what we're here for, really, to sell books as well as have an interesting conversation. Thank you all so much.